there. And then do slideshow. I think that should be it.
Okay, there you go. Do you want me to introduce you?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Sure. All right, guys. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay. Technical problems, as always. As you can see, Jack is not going to hold today's lecture. It's actually going to be me. My name is Patrick. I'm, fourth year PhD in the department. And I'm mainly doing research on international relations, but the stuff that I have to use in my everyday kind of activities, my everyday work is all methods. And in a sense, why I'm going to be talking to you about methods today is because methods is really, in a sense, what university is about. School is facts. University is methods. University is all about teaching you skills, really. It's not so much about you memorizing stuff for 4 years, as you know. It's about you picking up skills that you can employ in all kinds of walks of life later. And one of those very, very important skills is the ability to use a method, a scientific method, to be precise. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And how this is going to work is that at the beginning, lots of what I'm going to be talking about is going to sound very abstract. There's going to be lots of abstract concepts in there and lots of big ideas. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples how we can actually use this in a political science context. And I also have an example from another walk of life. Now, first of all, because I see some of you typing or even writing this down, all these slides are up on WebCT, Jack just told me, so there's no need to write this down. So, let's maybe start with something that what political science is, or let's rather start with what political science is not. I assume you might have heard that from the odd other speaker in this lecture, but thinking about what political science is not actually turns out to be based in methods. So that's actually based in what I'm going to be talking about later. Political science is not sociology, for example. Sociologists look at all of society. We only look at a tiny slice. We really only look at the political system, or how the political system acts on people, how people act in the political system. We also don't do law, obviously, because lawyers have no interest whatsoever in how laws are made. That's really the stuff that we're interested in. We're also not just doing history, because we have theories. Historians normally don't try to come up with big theories that explain, say, both the fall of the Roman Empire and today's United States, today's actions by the United States, right? That's normally not what they do, but that's what we do. That's what we're allowed to do. It's also not about philosophy. I think you've heard one or two people that have talked about the philosophical roots of political science, which is no doubt very interesting, but that's not the main aspect of political science, really. And we're also not politics, because we're doing science. I don't know how often you've been asked by people before, you have political science, I assume you want to become a politician. We all know that's not true, right? We don't want to do politics, we want to understand politics. So, with that, let's ask kind of the fundamental question, really. Is this even a science? Why are we calling this political science? Why aren't we just calling this what happens in politics or so? Well, first of all, that question has some base to it, right? We have a couple of problems that other sciences do not have. For example, we can't easily do experiments. We can't put people into test tubes. I can't, for example, phone up the Prime Minister of France and ask him, hey, could you please change your electoral system before the next election? I would really love to see if you win or if another guy wins just based on how people vote. The French, unfortunately, do not take kindly to those kind of suggestions. So we can't do that. We also have a little problem with something called generalizations. I'm actually going to talk about that on the next slide, but that's a lot harder for us. It's a lot harder for us to observe something in specific and then make some bigger prediction about the world than it is for other sciences. And lastly, for physics, it doesn't bother the theory of gravity one bit, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're a vegan or you eat meat, whether you're left or right, it doesn't matter. Gravity always works the same way. In political science research, that's not necessarily true. Either your background might subtly influence how you ask questions, or what you think is a convincing answer to those questions, and so on. So there's a couple of reasons why you could be skeptical about political science being an actual science. But if we do it properly, do certain things that other sciences do too. We try to find out, we try to look at data, we try to look at isolated things, and we try to make more general explanations about how the world works, right? We want to ask, say, 100 voters, and from that we want to come up with some explanation of how all voters are going to decide later. The procedures and the stuff that we use has to be public. No one in science can just say, well, I can't give you the results right now, but just trust me on this. It's there, I swear. No, you have to be able to look behind the curtain and see what the person is doing. We also always have to be uncertain of our conclusions. That sounds a little weird, but that just means that in science, we can never just say, oh yeah, I guess that's true now. I guess everyone that's on the right votes for a particular person. I guess that's just how it works. We always have to have a degree of uncertainty in there. And lastly, the content really of what we do as a science is the method. Now that sounds a little weird, but that just means that whether or not you're doing science, whether or not you're a scientist, depends on how you do things, not on what you look at. You can look at music scientifically, or you can look at music from a purely perspective of enjoyment, right? There's different perspectives to certain things, but if we do these things, if we try to infer something about the larger world, if our procedures are public, if our conclusions are uncertain, and if we use the right scientific methods, then we're doing science. That's also true for political science. So, I just said that generalization is hard for us. Well, that's kind of a pretty big problem actually for us in social science. So every generalization, every time you look at something little in the world and you try to say something about the bigger world, your prediction will have a certain scope. So how much of the world are you trying to explain? And it will have a certain certainty. How sure are you that that's true, what you're saying? Now in physics, this is super easy. Okay, once you've figured out this thing of gravity, in some place on Earth or so, that stuff is true for the whole universe, essentially. So in the natural sciences, you can generalize from very little things that you observe to the universe at large. That's awesome, right? You can just look at something in, say, Oxford, and it's true on whatever, Alpha Centauri or so. That's great. Doesn't work like that for social sciences. In the social sciences, we have a little saying that goes that the degree of probability of a statement varies inversely with its scope. So in other words, that means the more of the world I'm trying to explain, the less certain I am that that's really true. So for example, if I look at the random person here and I see someone in a green sweater, and I'm trying to generalize, I guess all Trinity students are wearing green sweaters on a Thursday, you can see that generalization is not going to go far, okay? So generalizations are hard in social sciences, and we try to find ways around that. So how do we solve this problem that we have, that the more of the world we try to explain, the less certain we are? Well, we try to break it down in a couple of easy steps. In political science, you can more or less say, there's plenty of people that might not fall into these two halves that I'm going to be talking about now, but you can generally say that there's two kinds of people in political science. There's one group of people that does a lot of theoretical work, that kind of build the foundations on which we want to build our house of explaining the world. And they try to come up with kind of the big ideas of how the world works. Okay, this is how elections work. This is why democracy is a great system. This is why the states trade lots with each other, and so on. Big theoretical ideas. And then there might be other people that take what's already out there on the theoretical front, and they try to actually test this with the real world. So we say that democracies are great because everyone's represented. Now let's look at whether everyone is actually represented in a democracy. And maybe it turns out that there's certain groups of people are systematically excluded. So you can either kind of develop causal theories, as it's called, or you can use different research methods to test those kind of theories. And the main thing really that we want to find out, the thing where we pat each other on the shoulder if we've done that, is the world is really, really messy. You've noticed this when you talk with anyone, when you have an intellectual conversation with anyone about any kind of bigger topic in the world, you realize that there's so much going on that it's really hard to come up with good answers. So the world is really messy, the world is really complex. So what we normally try to do is we try to break it down, pare it down, and boil down our explanations until we can say that one specific thing caused one other thing. Right? The US really, really needing more strategic oil reserves led to the Iraq War, or some such simplistic explanation. So that's really our goal. So how are we doing this? There's a structure to how science is done, and there's a structure of how political science is done. And I'm going to explain this a little bit, and later you're going to see that if you apply this to actual real cases of political science research, that this helps you understand what's going on. And this helps you read science, right? There's a skill to reading science. There's a skill to understanding why things are structured the way they are. Now, first of all, there's always a thing called a theory. Now, you've probably talked with other people, and you've come across a statement such as, oh, you're just saying that that's just a theory, right, that you have, which is meant to be kind of derogatory, I guess. Like, oh, you're just making that up, essentially. That's just like some baloney. That's not what theory means in science. In science, a theory can be extremely well supported. There can be lots and lots of evidence in favor of it, and we might as well treat it as a fact. One such theory is evolution. Right? The fact that it's called a theory doesn't mean that we're uncertain if it's true or not. It just means that it's a whole building made out of different ideas with lots of evidence to it and so on. This whole house of an idea we call a theory. There's an interesting theory in political science that I've put up there as an example. There's the theory of the democratic peace. The idea that democracies are peaceful. If you look around the world and you think of kind of the standard democracies that you come up with, say we look at in Europe, like Ireland, Sweden, and so on, they don't seem to be very warlike. So, a theory also has to stipulate a causal mechanism. That just means that they have to say something why that is true, right? They have to make up a convincing story, in a sense. Now, if the theory is the big house, then the hypotheses are the bricks, the building blocks, really, that consist of. And you can think of a hypothesis as kind of a one sentence that you can test, right? The one sentence, for example, for the democratic peace is that, well, democracies don't normally go to war with each other. If someone says that to you, then you can go home, look at Wikipedia, and figure out if that's a true statement. So, every theory has one or more hypotheses to it. So, let's make a little political science example. My theory is that whenever people's basic needs are fulfilled, whatever that is, we're going to come to that in a second, whenever their basic needs are fulfilled, they're going to be happy with their political system. So if we think about, well, how could we make this into a one-sentence statement that we can then test? So the one-sentence statement should have to do with, well, what are the causes here and what are the outcomes? So the causes would be, well, how if people's basic needs are fulfilled, and the outcomes would be that people are happy. This is also called independent and dependent variables. You might come about this when you actually read some more in-depth or more hardcore science papers that they often talk about variables. And there's two types of variables. There's independent variables, which are causes of something, so something that causes something else. Say a beer is a cause, and then there's an outcome, you being drunk. That's the dependent variable. Okay? So there's always causes and outcomes, and we try to find out the relationship between those two when we do this. So let's think about this in terms of our example again. So let's make this a little more concrete, and let's say, for example, that, well, I say that countries where citizens are both healthy and wealthy are less likely to experience revolutions. So I just substituted are happy with their political system by are less likely to have revolutions, because that's a little more tangible, because how are you going to measure how happy you are with your political system, right? I don't know, like a temperature scale, please tell me on a scale from 0 to 100 degrees, how happy are you with the T-shock, and so that doesn't really work that well. So let's just say revolutions. If people are happy, they won't have revolutions. Healthy and wealthy, obviously that's both great, right? If you're healthy but not wealthy, well, then you're poor, but in good health, that's not going to make you really happy with your situation. If you're wealthy but you have really brittle bones, you can't enjoy life, and so on. So we need two things together. That's at least what I say, right? My hypothesis here. How could we measure these both sides, right? So healthy and wealthy, we need to come up with a way of measuring these causes, and then revolutions, we need to come up with a way to measure this outcome. So let's say the dependent variable, remember, the outcome. Let's just look at a bunch of different countries and let's see if they've had a successful revolution since 1980, okay? We just look at, well, we look at a couple of countries in the world and we look at have they had a revolution or not. And then we look at, well, how wealthy were the people there and how healthy were they? Again, we need to find some measurements for this. And for wealth, I just say, well, how much do they produce in their GDP? And for health, I just say, well, do you have a universal healthcare system? Maybe we could also have said we go for life expectancy or so. So think for a second, well, how could those variables look like? And maybe what countries would you look at? Would you look at all countries in the world? Well, I didn't have time to do that, so I just looked at 4 countries. And I'm just telling you, for example, that that is a representative sample of the world. Okay, I've looked at 4 countries, Cuba, Haiti, Spain, and the US. And we see that only one of those countries has experienced a revolution, namely Haiti, since 1980. And then let's look at how healthy and wealthy the people are in these countries. Well, Cuba, not that great. Haiti, really bad. Spain, pretty rich. US, filthy rich. Healthcare, remember, universal healthcare system is there in Cuba and in Spain. Cuba actually has an excellent healthcare system and one of the highest life expectancies in the world, which you wouldn't think. And on the other hand, Haiti and the US have no universal healthcare system. So we know now how healthy and wealthy the people are in these countries, and we also know which country experienced a revolution. So let's just put this in a little table. So to test my hypothesis of when people are healthy and wealthy, there's not going to be a revolution. And we look at the table and we find, my God, that's true. I just made up a really good theory of why revolutions occur, because the only country in which there was a revolution is the one that is where people are neither wealthy nor healthy. So that's how political science research could work. It's a little more sophisticated than this, I want to say. For example, you could argue, well, why are you looking at those 4 countries? Maybe if you look at lots of other countries, maybe totally different stuff happens. Why are you looking at health and wealth? Right? Why aren't you looking at all kinds of other things that might influence whether people have a revolution or not? This is a map I always like to show because it's a really interesting one. This is apparently you can measure happiness by whatever metric, and then you can graph it on the world, and you see that there is an interesting distribution of happiness. Right? Northern America, for example, is pretty happy. Australia, happy-go-lucky. But then there's a couple of countries in there that are kind of weird, right? You see the Arabian Peninsula there. There's Oman and the United Arab Emirates, are very happy countries. Or on the other hand, Bhutan. Do you see this tiny speck there? North of India, Bhutan is an extremely happy country. Actually, it's the country that came up with the gross national happiness as a metric for how well it's doing. It's not looking at GDP, it's looking at happiness. And you see that this doesn't necessarily overlap with whether there's revolutions or conflicts or so in the world. So maybe there's more to happiness. Okay, so let's go from this example to something more general. When you have a theory, when you have a hunch about the world, and you want to go about testing that hunch, which is really what science is about, then you have basically 2 ways of doing that. At least that's what I'm going to tell you now. There might be others, or there might be mixed methods or so, but in general, you can either do that with lots of numbers, with a computer, with a statistics program, right, which all looks very mathematical, which is called quantitative research. You essentially sit down, I would sit down, I would look at all 188 countries of the world, and I would go back 20 years, and for each year, I would measure how healthy and wealthy are people, is there evolution, and so on. And at the end, my statistics program would spit out whether my statement is true or not. Or, of course, I could, and this would be a smart thing if you're doing a PhD, I could say, well, I don't think I can measure this from home. I think I actually have to go to all these countries to interview people. Which is great because that means you get around. Had I realized that in my first year, I would have been a little more well-traveled now. So that's what's called qualitative research. You deal with smaller numbers, you go into the street and ask 100 people or so, or you only ask very specific people. You have interviews with leaders of states, for example, or with party leaders, or with all kinds of other community organizers. So there's different ways of going about this. And these methods can be complementary. So think about it. How would you have answered this kind of question, right? Would you have gone, oh, well, I guess the numbers are going to tell me? Or would you have gone, well, I guess I have to ask people, right? Why are you in support of revolution or not? So, this is just, I'm just going to go over this really briefly, but the thing that we really want to do with this kind of research is we want to establish causality. So I tried to establish causality. I wanted to establish a cause of something. I wanted to establish that people are healthy and wealthy, and for that reason they don't have a revolution. Of course we have a problem. I already said this at the beginning. We can't experiment. So for example, I can't look at Haiti in 1980. I see, oh, they've had a revolution, and then I rerun history and I make the Haitians a little more healthy or a little more wealthy, and I look if it still works. That obviously, that's not how this is conducted. And we have this problem especially in the social sciences. Two solutions: A, go home. B, well, try to make it work nonetheless. Try to design your research in a way that gets around this problem, right? For example, one solution would be, well, find a country that's a lot like Haiti. Find a country that's also poor and where the people are not healthy, but that has not had a revolution. Okay, and then see, well, where else do these countries differ? Try to keep lots of things constant and see, much like in a medical trial, right? You try to find lots of people that are very similar, and if some experience a weird reaction to the product and the other ones don't, then there is something else going on. So this is always good to have in mind. These are a couple of factors that you can keep in mind if you talk with someone, also just in the pub or so. If someone says, oh, well, that's all caused by X, then think about these couple of factors. We have to have temporal ordering in order to establish causality. What does that mean? That just means that, well, you have to drink before you become drunk. If your buddy shows up in the pub and he's already staggering, and then he drinks 3 beers, then those beers were not contributing to his drunkenness in the first place. There has to be a correlation between so two things have to move in unison or move opposite each other. So there has to be something going on between these two factors. We have to be able to tell a plausible story. Now this is important, for example, because lots of pseudoscience or so cannot really tell you plausible stories. When I say that, I mean things like, I felt really bad today because yesterday someone punched me in the aura. Okay, that's not there's no plausible story that you can tell why that should affect you. Okay, you have to tell a story that a majority of an audience would understand and subscribe to if you have two factors that are supposed to influence each other. And then lastly, you have to rule out confounds. This is just what I talked about earlier. Well, maybe our revolutions have nothing to do with people being healthy and wealthy. Maybe they have to do with whether people are able to participate in their political system or not. And that's all. If you have a democracy, people are not going to rise up. If you have an autocratic system, they are. Okay, so what are we going to do now? I'm going to show you 3 examples, 2 from political science and 1 non-political sciencey one. And we're going to think about, well, how can we apply this template, and how does this help us understand what people are doing there? And you're going to see that actually if you apply this to what you have to read maybe for the course, or later in your university life, it makes it easier to understand this stuff. So first, there's a theory that I talked about earlier called the democratic peace. Has anyone ever heard of this theory? Yes, a couple of people? Okay, very nice. So the democratic peace theory says that democracies are peaceful. No, hang on, actually it doesn't say that, because if we look at a couple of democracies, such as the United States, such as Israel, such as France, it's clear that democracies have in general not necessarily a problem with going to war. It's just that they don't go to war with each other. So in other words, could you imagine Ireland fighting a war against the UK? Well, maybe about rugby or so, yes, maybe. But in any case, no. In regular democracies, this is inconceivable, right? So the democratic peace really says that, well, democracies aren't going to fight each other. And this has been called the closest thing to a law we have in international relations. Remember that in international relations, states can pretty much do whatever they want, okay? They can make treaties, they can break treaties, they can walk away, they can cooperate, and so there's no rules, but this seems still to work. So, let's think about this systematically, okay? What's the question here? Well, the question is really, what explains war and peace? Maybe one of the most important questions in all of political science, because war is so terrible and peace is so desirable, which is why we are really interested in figuring out why the one happens and not the other. So what explains war and peace? Well, maybe war and peace is explained by whether or not a country is a democracy. Right? That's our theory. Now, what could be the story that we tell why that should be true? Well, maybe, for example, Ireland doesn't go to war because Ireland is a democracy. That means you all can vote and ask yourself if you would vote for a candidate whose main platform is, I'm going to attack Italy next year. That's probably not going to work, right? Because for most voters, there's nothing in it in war. Right? Most of you, no average voter is going to be better off after a war than before. And there's even the risk that it would be way, way, way worse off than before. So maybe democracies don't go to war with each other because voters just dislike war. Maybe this is also just because democracies are generally wealthy countries. Wealthy countries have lots to lose in a conflict, so maybe that's why they don't go to war. So there's a couple of different kind of plausible stories that we could tell. Maybe this just has to do with leaders in democratic countries being very used to negotiation, right? You have to work your way all the way up from the City Council of Cork to the ministership, and then eventually leading Ireland. By the time you get there after 25 years, you're so used to negotiating and not just punching people in the face to get where you want, that you're not going to change that as a leader of a state. Okay, so how can we test this? Well, we have to look at how democratic are countries, and then have they had a war? Okay, democracy is the cause here, war is the outcome. How do we measure this actually? Let's just say we use the Freedom House Index maybe. Everyone knows Freedom House, right? Those are the guys that rank how democratic a country is on lots of different metrics. There's lots of discussion going on if that's good, but every country gets just one number. That means how democratic it is, and then we look at, well, have they had conflicts? Over 1,000 deaths. This sounds slightly cynical, but that just means that we can't have any kind of tiny border skirmishes with just 100 dead or so. We don't call that a war. We have to draw the line somewhere. What's a war? So let's see how this works out in practice. We just put two things on a scale here. You see on the bottom, there's the years. So this goes from the Second World War all the way up to now, almost. And what you see there is, you see the red line is the number of democracies. The blue line that starts all the way at the bottom are wars that happened in the world. And the purple line that starts on the top and then falls sharply is the number of non-democratic countries in the world. Now, just from looking at that graph, that seems pretty convincing, right? By the same time that the number of democracies goes up and the number of non-democracies goes down, we also see the number of conflicts, the blue line, also goes down. So just from looking at that graph, that actually sounds kind of probable, right? The more democracies you will have in the world, the less likely those states will be to fight each other, and that also means that we should have greater overall peace. So just from that, actually sounds pretty convincing, doesn't it? So, of course, we have a couple of problems. Maybe this is the other way around, for example. Maybe it's because you don't have a war that you feel safe building a democracy. If people are constantly shooting each other, no one's going to run for parliament. So maybe this is the other way. Maybe we have it the wrong way around. Maybe you have to have peace first and then you build a democracy, not like we thought. Or maybe this is just purely based on economic factors. Because states have gotten ever wealthier, maybe they're less likely to fight a war. This has also been famously called the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. Think of it like two countries that have a McDonald's franchise are not going to go to war with each other. A clever guy called Thomas Friedman came up with that example. And he's pretty much 99% true. Russia invaded South Ossetia, as you're aware, a couple of years back. Both had a McDonald's franchise. Thomas Friedman didn't like that day when that happened. Still, it holds mostly true. Maybe it's economic factors, right? Maybe it's not democracy. Or maybe, if you look at this again, you see that, well, these lines crossing all happened after the end of the Cold War. So maybe it was just that the Cold War was over. Okay, so that's how a political science theory works. Let me show you another example, one that I like, because it's been in the big newspaper. This was the New York Times from 2010. Now, the New York Times here in this little article talks about, well, there has apparently been a spate of crimes in New York. People have broken open gym lockers and like robbed banks, robbed other people in the street. And all these random crimes had nothing in common, but one thing. They all wore stuff with the Yankees logo on it. All the criminals in these crimes at the time of their crime or at the time when they were apprehended wore Yankees merchandise. So the New York Times tells us, yeah, you know, maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's a theory. Maybe if the question is, how do you spot a criminal in New York? Maybe the answer is, well, maybe you just have to look at what clothes they wear. What's the theory behind this? Well, the theory behind this is criminals like certain clothes. If you run around in the hard streets of New York, you're not going to wear a pink polo shirt. When you commit a robbery, you're going to wear something that gives you some street cred. Something that looks tough or so, and maybe the local team is just what you need. So you wear a giant oversized Yankees shirt. The causal mechanism here, of course, is, well, criminals wear certain things because they make them look cool. And that's why they choose stuff with the Yankees logo on it. So if we want to make a testable claim about this, a hypothesis, it would be, well, certainly if that's all true, if criminals like certain clothes because they make them look tough, then certainly a majority of criminals should wear those clothes. So certainly a majority of criminals in New York should wear Yankee stuff. If we think about causes and outcomes, about variables here, that's very easy. The more criminal you are, the more likely you should be to wear Yankee stuff. It's pretty simple stuff, pretty simple study. And the article even helpfully provides a little test, because they say, well, we've looked at lots of arrest records, and since 2000, the article was written in 2010, over 100 people have been arrested wearing Yankees clothes. So, do we buy this? Or are there some reasons to be skeptical? Well, obviously there's some reasons to be skeptical because that theory is complete BS, okay? We know that. We probably knew that when we looked at the article that can't be true, but let's think about it systematically, right? The causal mechanism, the story that it tells, is obvious baloney, right? It's not that criminals like Yankee stuff, it's that everyone kind of likes Yankee stuff, at least in New York. So obviously it's not just criminals that like to wear cool clothes, it's everyone. So that can't be a distinguishing feature. Then on the other hand, of course, many criminals don't wear Yankees clothes. The article so helpfully suggests 100 people have been seen in Yankee clothes, but then it turns out that in 1 week in New York City, there's 2,000 crimes. So if you multiply that by 50 weeks, and then by 10 years or so, you get roughly 1 million crimes over 10 years. And the New York Times suggests that because in 100 out of 1 million cases, that means we should believe that the Yankee stuff is somehow indicative of a criminal. So that, for example, is not science. But using this template is certainly better than just saying, oh, I don't think that's true, is it? No, I don't know. So it's better to apply a certain template to this because then you systematically can see where this has weak points. So this is not science. It still made it into the New York Times, which I can't forgive them for. I've held this lecture like once or twice before, and I always make this example because I can't let that one go. Okay, lastly, who here, does anyone recognize this particular map? It's a map of the world, and it shows you certain civilizations grouped together in very large groups. Does anyone know where this comes from? Has anyone here heard of The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington? Yeah, show of hands. Anyone heard of that? Okay, so a fair number. So you heard of this maybe like in a casual conversation, or you've picked it up, and it's often believed to be a very, a kind of a smart, very big idea about how the world works. So you see, for those that haven't looked at this, while Samuel Huntington wrote a book in the 90s that looked at the world, he grouped some lots of countries together into civilizations, what he called. So for example, here we see the Western civilization, which is Europe, North America, Australia. I don't know why Papua New Guinea is in there. If that's Timor, I don't know. Then you have kind of the Eastern countries. Then you have the China and Southeast Asia. You have Southern Africa. Then you have what he just lumps together as Islamic states. You see the shaded area, right? That goes all the way from Western Africa all the way to Pakistan there. And then you have poor Ethiopia, who is in there somehow all by itself. I actually haven't read the book detail enough to know why he does that, but Ethiopia, the poor odd one out. So what does Huntington actually say? Well, Huntington actually says, well, look, the Cold War is over, so what's going to happen next? Now that the US is not against the Soviet Union anymore, are we all just going to hold hands, put flowers in our hair, be all nice to each other? Is there going to be no more war, no more conflict? Or if we think that there could be conflict, where is this conflict coming from? So again, this is one of the really fundamental questions of political science. Why could there be war or conflict? And maybe how can we prevent that? So his theory really is that, well, those conflicts are not going to be based on economy. They're not going to be based on oil or natural resources or whether or not someone trades with someone else. They're also not going to be based on ideology. They're not going to be based on like Western liberalism versus communism or so. They're not going to be based on any of that. All that's irrelevant, says Huntington. What's really important is culture. The next conflicts, the next wars are going to be culture wars. There's going to be civilizations that are clashing, right? Not just single states, not economies, not ideological models, but whole civilizations are going to clash. And he thinks that the main clash here really is going to happen between the West in blue and the Islamic Confucian states, which actually lumps together even more than the Islamic states already. That goes from Western Africa all the way to China. And that's what he says is going to be the main source of conflict. There's a couple of stories you could tell why this should lead to conflict. Imagine, for example, that there's a Chinese minority in a different civilization that's systematically oppressed. Maybe that makes the Chinese intervene in that other country to protect their countrymen. Think about what I just said about Russia and Southeast Asia. That was actually the reason that the Russians gave, right? There were Russian lives at stake here. We protected our people, okay? Maybe this is also just a clash of values, right? Maybe we're going to invade some non-Western states because we want to spread democracy. In any case, so his hypothesis, his testable thing is, well, I think, he says, the dominating source of conflict is going to be cultural. So think about what all the other things are that are not influencing conflict in his kind of model, in his theory. So in other words, if you have two countries, the more culturally different they are, the more likely they're going to be to have a war with each other. Now, I'm not going to do this by hand raising, but think about how many of you read that book and you thought that was maybe kind of a smart idea or kind of a good overall idea about the world. But it turns out there's a couple of very good reasons to be skeptical about this very large idea about the world that he has. Well, first of all, I don't need to point this out, you're all smart people, but all the countries that he lumps together in civilizations are obviously very, very different. So think that for example, his Islamic countries takes in everything from Tunisia to Afghanistan. Now, those two countries probably have little else in common rather than having a Muslim majority. Okay, otherwise life in Tunisia and Afghanistan are not going to be the same on a day-to-day basis. Same is true for lots of the other cultures. For example, all Europe is suddenly one culture, even though we, as we're in Europe, can see lots of fault lines on lots of different issues. So obviously, what he tries to do is he tries to cast civilization as these giant building blocks, these immutable things, and certainly they're not. We might, for example, have a lot more in common with each other than he believes. There might be a lot more commonality. So for example, it might well be that we have a lot more in common with other cultures than you would normally think. Think of the Arab Spring, for example. It turns out suddenly that lots and lots of people in Northern Africa are all not just using Twitter, but also all really, really like more democracy, that they go out in the street and protest, and you suddenly see that there's a lot more that's in common there. And of course, we might have lots more exchange. Think about this. This is kind of thinking of civilizations as something that, well, you kind of stay with your own people all the time, everywhere. When of course we don't. There's lots of exchange, there's lots of interactions and so on. And then, of course, the one more fundamental thing is he has a very, very large theory about the whole world. And that means that by necessity, we have to be pretty uncertain of that. Because there's no way that you could have hit on the one giant law of international relations and how people interact with that kind of a book. There's a couple of problems that just come from how do you go about testing this. For example, Huntington gives you lots of little stories about how conflicts broke out between one and the other country and how these civilizations were different and so on. But there's a nice little saying in science in general and in social science in particular, the plural of anecdote is not data. So if someone tells me, my God, my 3 cousins all tried the Huntington Beach diet and they all lost 80 pounds, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a full-fledged scientific theory and is true for all people. Okay? So just because you can come up with a couple of stories that seem to support your side, doesn't mean that you've proved anything. That's not very systematic. And we can also see if we look at something like this, which shows you what kind of values are supported by people in Western states, that's the red, and Islamic states, that's the gray, that you actually see that, yes, there are some differences. For example, homosexuality is a lot less accepted in Islamic states than it is in Western states. Same goes for things like abortion and so. But look at the actual political science variables in here. Look at the actual politics variables in here. Look at democratic performance, and democratic ideals. How supportive are you of democracy as an idea? And you see, there's no difference whatsoever. Again, if we think about the Arab Spring, it suddenly becomes clear that maybe that was there all the way. Maybe that was there all the time. We just didn't recognize it. So it's hard to think from this that there's going to be a giant war between these cultures just based on some weird aspect that we can't quite grasp. So there's two slides of take-home lessons from this little lecture. I said this at the beginning. I'm going to say it again. So whether or not you're doing science, whether or not you're a scientist, depends on how you do things, not really what you look at. You can be a physicist and do it totally wrong and get the wrong stuff and not do proper science. Or you can be a political scientist and do everything right, and then your things are just as good. And whenever you see the term science anywhere, or when you think you read science, think about a couple of steps that have to be there for you to believe that that's proper science. Is there a decent question? Or is whoever's writing that just kind of milling about, going, oh, there was this interesting thing I came across on the weekend? No, it has to have a clear question, right? It has to be described properly. It has to tell you a good story about why things happen. Does it make any testable claims? And does it actually test that? Or does it just say, I think this is how the world works? Finish. Like, that's not good enough, okay? We need some proof that this is all working. And lastly, do the results make sense to you? Maybe someone's trying to lie to you with statistics. Very popular. Now, lastly, really what I was trying to do here is I was trying to show you a bit about methods in political science, about kind of what templates do we employ that are actually very similar to how other scientists are doing this. So we also have questions, we have theories, we have hypotheses, we have tests, we have results. And once you recognize that this is the template how science is done, it's going to become easier for you to, for example, read science and to understand science. Because you're not just reading the article hoping that it's going to be summarized in 4 sentences somewhere at the end. But you can pinpoint, okay, I guess this is the question, this is what they think is going to happen, then they test this, and then, oh, looky, it actually does happen, what they think should happen. And once you recognize this is going to cut down on the time it takes you to understand these kind of things and to read these kind of things. Lots of what you read is not science, as evidenced by the New York Times article. even when it comes about all sciencey. There's a wonderful chap in the UK called Ben Goldacre who writes very entertainingly about lots of bad science in the areas of medicine and stuff like homeopathy, and so has a very entertaining blog that I encourage you to check out. So in other words, lots of stuff that comes to you packaged in something called science is actually not science. It's just a load of BS. And try to see through that. And it makes it a lot easier if you think of this template here to see through this. And always be critical of what you read. Okay, so if anyone in science ever tries to stand in front of you and goes, here, this is how the world works, just trust me on this, instantly disbelieve the guy. So please also disbelieve everything I've just told you in the last hour or so. So that's really my take-home lesson, right? Methods in political science are really what defines us as a science, what's really important for you, and what makes us valuable as a discipline, so to say. Okay, thanks guys, that was fun. If you have any questions, my email.